La 9540e séance du Conseil de sécurité est ouverte. L'ordre du jour provisoire de la présente séance est la situation au Moyen-Orient, y compris la question palestinienne. L'ordre du jour est adopté. Conformément à l'article 37 du règlement intérieur provisoire du Conseil, j'invite les représentants de l'Afrique du Sud et d'Israël à participer à la présente séance. Il en est ainsi décidé. Je propose que, conformément aux dispositions de son règlement intérieur provisoire et à la pratique établie en la matière, le Conseil invite l'observateur permanent de l'État observateur de Palestine auprès de l'Organisation des Nations Unies à participer à la présente séance. En l'absence d'objection, il en est ainsi décidé. Conformément à l'article 39 du règlement intérieur provisoire du Conseil, j'invite M. Martin Griffiths, secrétaire général adjoint aux affaires humanitaires et coordonnateur des secours d'urgence, à participer à la présente séance. Il en est ainsi décidé. Le Conseil de sécurité va maintenant aborder l'examen du point 2 de l'ordre du jour. Et je donne à présent la parole à M. Martin Griffiths.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. And that's all the French you'll be getting from me, I think. Otherwise, I'll be in trouble with the British, as you know. So thank you very much indeed for this opportunity to brief the Council today, and I'm very grateful to you also for allowing my colleague to sit in for me once I've made my remarks. Thank you very much. That's very thoughtful. Each day that passes only, of course, deepens the misery and suffering of the people in Gaza, and indeed in Israel. The number of people killed in Gaza has reportedly surpassed 26,000, and the number of injured reportedly more than 65,000, according to Gaza's Ministry of Health, the vast majority being women and children. And we've heard these figures before, and they keep mounting, and we've also heard challenges as to whether they are the right source. But this is the source that we have been using for some years. 14 of the 36 hospitals in Gaza are functional, and these only partially. They face severe shortages of medical staff and supplies. Fierce fighting, as we know, has continued in the vicinity of the Nasser and Al-Amal hospitals in Khan Yunis, threatening the safety of medical staff, the wounded and the sick, as well as the thousands of IDPs seeking refuge there. The intense fighting around Khan Yunis continues to drive thousands of people into Rafah, of course, already hosting over half of Gaza's population of 2.2 million people. Thus, the compression of people in Rafah is a major issue of concern for all of us, but for us in the humanitarian agencies. Across Gaza, over 60% of housing units are reportedly, allegedly destroyed or damaged. We now estimate that some 75% of the total population have been displaced, and their living conditions are getting worse each day. Heavy rains are flooding the makeshift tent camps. forcing children, parents, and the elderly to sleep in the mud if they can. And clean water is almost completely inaccessible. With little public health support available, preventable diseases are therefore rife and will continue to spread and will become, if they have not already, become the chief killer of Gazans. Madame la Présidente, as I mentioned in my briefing to the Council a couple of weeks ago, the further spread of hostilities southwards, along with the increasing deprivation and desperation of people there, can only be expected to increase the pressure for mass displacement into neighboring countries, the so-called spillover. Some Palestinians in Gaza have already been able to leave through Egypt. In the meantime, there are seriously injured or sick patients unable to receive cure in Gaza, for whom medical evacuations should be swiftly facilitated. And we know that this is a matter of daily negotiation in the COGAT group, which meets daily to discuss all the matters of logistics and plans of the humanitarian operation. Of course, I want to say that these evacuations is in line with international humanitarian law, which in certain circumstances encourages arrangements for the evacuation of the wounded and the sick, persons with disabilities, older children, and pregnant women. I personally vividly remember removing those categories of people back in 1997, can you imagine, from the Tingi camp in the Congo and the Kivus, and they were allowed out before the attack on the camp came. I also want to emphasize once again that any persons displaced from Gaza must be guaranteed the right to voluntarily return as international law demands. Madame la Présidente, I know you heard yesterday from my good colleague, Under-Secretary General Sigrid Kaag, the Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator, to give her clunky title, regarding her efforts to expedite the delivery of humanitarian assistance to Gaza. The ability of the humanitarian community to reach the people of Gaza with relief remains grossly inadequate. And to say it's grossly inadequate, as it says here, is grossly inadequate. It's much more difficult than that. And I was in a conversation yesterday with a senior director of the World Food Programme, who had just come out of Gaza, and who said it's the congestion, it's the rains, it's the lack of certainty about what tomorrow will bring, as well as the lack of fuel and supplies and deconflictions, as much as anything else, which makes a humanitarian operation so difficult. But it's not for want of trying. Despite the hazardous conditions on the ground, we're distributing food items to shelters, supporting the remaining bakeries, and I think WFP is also doing this through cash assistance. We're delivering medicines, we being, of course, WHO, MSF, and others, and medical supplies and helping to relocate patients. Water, hygiene kits, cleaning kits, tents, tarpaulin sheets, blankets, UNICEF, and others, IOM. But all of these supplies in quantities that are, of course, far from adequate, given the numbers of people compressed into this tiny, congested, muddy part of the world. So if the people of Gaza are to receive anything approaching the amount of humanitarian assistance they need and deserve, urgent steps must be taken. I'm sorry to repeat things that you will have heard before. First, we need to be able to deliver and distribute supplies safely. This means we need significantly improved security assurances. We need to be able to rely on deconfliction there as we need to rely on it elsewhere. Second, a predictable flow of supplies. One of the very human parts of a humanitarian operation, especially in circumstances like this, and we've heard it in Gaza, is how important it is for people to know when the next round of supplies is coming, so that they know that they can eat this food now, because by next week there will be more. Finally, we need, of course, rapid and unimpeded access. We need to be able to enter Gaza via multiple points from Egypt and Israel. This would help clear bottlenecks, speed up delivery of supplies. We continue to face the issue of the rejection for entry of much-needed items into Gaza by Israel for reasons which are, at least to us, unclear and inconsistent. And as we know anecdotally, the whole truck gets sent back if there are items on it which are possibly dual use and therefore prohibited. We need to have access to civilians in need across Gaza. At present, our access to Khan Yunis, the middle area, and North Gaza is largely absent. A colleague of mine is on his way to make a second assessment in the north as we speak. Jamie McGoldrick, our Red Humanitarian Coordinator, Deputy Special Coordinator, is leading efforts to scale up operations in critical areas. Jamie is a very practical person with huge experience in humanitarian operations. He used to work for me 30 years ago in the humanitarian predecessor of OCHA, and he looks at these matters in a very practical way, and he is able, therefore, to put forward plans and requests to the committee that meets nightly, I think, the so-called COGAT committee, based on a very, very practical and experienced thing. He's not asking for the moon. He's leading efforts to scale up operations in critical areas. He's very worried, as he says to me in these last days, about whether we will succeed in meeting the needs that we need to meet, especially if we're all lucky enough to see a pause, to allow more in. We've also had difficulties getting access through Keresh Shalom in recent days because of demonstrations. I think we were able to get in yesterday, I think also today. And of course, Sigrid is working on the so-called mechanism to improve, analyze, and expedite the tracks of aid going into Gaza from outside. The breadth of the humanitarian community, including UN agencies, NGOs, the Red Cross, and the Red Crescents, is collaborating to ensure that aid reaches people in need to the greatest extent possible. You will not be surprised to hear that the beating heart of all this is UNRWA. You will not be surprised to hear that UNRWA has provided shelter, it has provided food and water, it has provided medical assistance. All this even while its own staff have been killed, injured, and displaced. I am firmly one of those appalled by the allegations, the accusations, not the accusations, but the idea that some UNRWA employees were allegedly involved in the attack of Israel on the 7th of October. I have seen the movie. These allegations, as we heard yesterday from the Secretary General, are being swiftly looked into, are being addressed transparently, and I'm very pleased to note and I've had many conversations with Philippe Lazzarini and others, that UNRWA has taken swift action on this evidence, and an investigation is already underway. But UNRWA's life-saving services, as was mentioned by so many member states yesterday, to over three-quarters of Gaza's residents, should not be jeopardized by the alleged actions of a few individuals. It is a matter of extraordinary disproportion. Likewise, UNRWA's support for Palestinians in need in the West Bank. We seldom talk about the West Bank because Gaza, of course, is the center of gravity of this terrible tragedy. But we have significant concerns over the worsening situation there, as well as in Lebanon, in Jordan and Syria, must also be safeguarded. It's tragic to think that the small steps that we have been observing and that we discussed in closed session the other day on Syria are at risk because of these events. But to put it very simply and bluntly, our humanitarian response for the occupied Palestinian territory is dependent, completely dependent, on UNRWA being adequately funded and operational. And you can be sure that we will all be spending all our efforts to try to make this happen, and to make it happen in a way that meets the requirements of neutrality and assurances to those interested. UNRWA is playing an indispensable role in terms of distribution, warehousing, logistics, human resources, 3,000 staff responding to the current crisis. Our Deputy Humanitarian Coordinator for Gaza is the UNRWA Director for Gaza, because we chose him because he had the greatest knowledge of what was happening and the greatest reach of what might be used. So, of course, we would like to see decisions to withhold funds to UNRWA revoked. Madame la Présidente, in closing, I repeat, of course, my request and demand for compliance with international humanitarian law, including the protection of civilians and the infrastructure they depend on. Hospitals, medical personnel, patients must be protected. It is quite remarkable in these days, in these recent months, how health institutions, not just in Gaza, not just in the occupied territories, but in different parts of the world, how health institutions have become a target of all things, as well as humanitarian aid workers of all people. So I reiterate my call for the immediate release of all hostages. I have met them and their families as well. Unconditional release, humane treatment, and of course, I cannot end without repeating the appeal of our Secretary General for a humanitarian ceasefire so that we can start rebuilding Gaza and giving its families a sense of a future. Thank you, Madame. Merci.
Je remercie Martin Griffiths de son exposé et je donne maintenant la parole aux membres du Conseil qui souhaitent faire une déclaration. Je donne la parole au représentant de l'Algérie.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. بداية أود أن أشكر الرئاسة الفرنسية على سرعة استجابتها لطلبنا بعقد هذا الاجتماع، كما أشكر السيد مارتن جريفيث على إحاطته الوافية. يأتي اجتماعنا هذا والعدوان على الشعب الفلسطيني يقترب من شهره الخامس، ويأتي بعد أن قبلت محكمة العدل الدولية النظر دعوة حدوث انتهاكات الاتفاقية الأمم المتحدة بشأن الإبادة الجماعية بقطاع غزة. إن هذا القرار التاريخي يؤكد أن زمن الإفلات من العقاب قد انتهى دون رجعة. لقد آلت الأمم المتحدة والمجموعة الدولية على نفسها أن لا يفلت أي مجرم من العقاب، والمحتل الإسرائيلي لا يجب أن يكون استثناء من هذه القاعدة. لا بد من ضمان المساءلة والمحاسبة حتى نحمي أجيال المستقبل من مثل الفظائع المرتكبة الآن بغزة. مثلما أكد رئيس الجمهورية السيد عبد المجيد تبون، سيكتب التاريخ كل من يقف وراء جرائم الإبادة بغزة في عداد مجرمي الحرب وأعداء الحياة والإنسانية. كما نشدد على أن التدابير التحفظية التي طالبت بها محكمة العدل الدولية واجبة للتنفيذ لحماية الشعب الفلسطيني من الإبادة التي يتعرض لها. نؤكد هنا إنه على إسرائيل القوة القائمة بالاحتلال الاستجابة فوراً للتدابير التي أقرتها المحكمة. كما إنه من واجب المجتمع الدولي أن يضمن التزامها بهذه التدابير. لا بد من وقف حمام الدم والإبادة التي يتعرض لها الفلسطينيون. سيد الرئيس، إن التدابير التحفظية التي أقرتها محكمة العدل الدولية لا يمكن تطبيقها إلا من خلال وقف إطلاق النار. لا بد من وقف هذا العدوان العبثي الآن. لا بد من وقف إطلاق النار فوراً. وعلى كل من يعترض على ذلك أن يسائل ضميره ويراجع إنسانيته. إن ما يحدث في غزة من فظائع ترفضه الفطرة الإنسانية السليمة. إن عدم وقف إطلاق النار يعني الرضا على 250 شخص سيتم قتلهم كل يوم. 100 طفل سيتم قتلهم كل يوم. 10 أطفال سيتم بتر أطرافهم كل يوم من دون مواد تخدير. إن 170 طفل سيولدون كل يوم في غزة على قارعة الطريق وعلى أبواب المستشفيات لانعدام الخدمات الصحية. إن 90% من سكان غزة سيبيتون في العراء ولا يجدون ما يشبع جوعهم. أن 10,000 شخص مصاب بسرطان يموتون كل لحظة نتيجة غياب العلاج الكيميائي. إنها كارثة، إنها كارثة إنسانية تقع أمام أعيننا، وجريمة إبادة مكتملة الأركان. لا يوجد أي شيء يمكن أن يبرر هذه الهمجية في حق الشعب الفلسطيني. سيد الرئيس، لقد نطق لسان العدالة بحكمه، وعلى كل من يؤمن بنظام عالمي يقوم على القانون أن يعمل على تنفيذ التدابير التحفظية التي أقرتها محكمة العدل الدولية. هذه المحكمة التي قضت بأنه يجب على إسرائيل القوة القائمة بالاحتلال أن تضمن وبشكل فوري عدم قيام قواتها بارتكاب أي أعمال قتل في حق الفلسطينيين، ويجب عليها اتخاذ إجراءات فورية وفعالة لضمان توفير الخدمات الأساسية والمستعدات الإنسانية التي يحتاج إليها الفلسطينيون في قطاع غزة. هذا هو حكم محكمة العدل الدولية، وهو أمر يحتاج وقفا فوريا لإطلاق النار. على مجلس الأمن الآن أن يتخذ فورا ودون تأخير كافة التدابير اللازمة من أجل إعلاء صوت العدالة وضمان تنفيذ قرارات محكمة العدل الدولية. وشكرا.
Je remercie le représentant de l'Algérie de sa déclaration et je donne maintenant la parole à la représentante des États-Unis.
Thank you, Madam President. Good morning to all, and thank you to Undersecretary General Griffiths for your briefing. There's no doubt that the humanitarian situation in Gaza is dire. Yesterday, Senior Coordinator COG outlined steps the UN proposes to take to accelerate and expand the delivery of aid at scale. I was pleased that the Council endorsed and united behind her plan because her success is the UN's success in Gaza. The question before us today is, what more can be done to facilitate her work to help expedite safe, unhindered, and expanded humanitarian access as called for in resolutions 2712 and 2720. Some members have argued that the provisional measures ordered by the International Court of Justice are a reason to change course. But in many ways, the court's measures reaffirm the framework that we put in place with Resolution 2712 and 2720. The court's provisional measures order is consistent with the United States' view that Israel has the right to take action in accordance with international humanitarian law to ensure the terrorist attacks of October 7th cannot be repeated. Of course, how Israel defends itself matters. Echoing Resolution 2712 and 2720, the court emphasized that all parties to the conflict are bound by international humanitarian law. It also echoed the United States' repeated calls for Israel to take all possible steps to minimize harm to civilians and humanitarian workers, to increase the flow of humanitarian assistance, and to address dehumanizing rhetoric. In our conversations with Israel's leaders, the United States has been clear, as has this Council, about the urgent need to increase the flow of food, water, and medicine so that it reaches all those civilians in Gaza who desperately need it. But colleagues, while we all agree more must be done, and though we are all broken by the extraordinary loss of civilian lives, we must be honest about what the court did not order. Specifically, it has not ordered an immediate ceasefire. It has not made any finding that this preliminary phase of the proceedings that Israel committed genocide or otherwise violated the Genocide Convention, and indeed the United States continues to believe that such allegations are unfounded. And that rather than try and will a ceasefire into existence when the conditions to sustain it, unfortunately, don't exist, we must instead work toward a durable solution to this conflict through the hard work of on-the-ground, relentless diplomacy. Diplomacy like the kind the United States has pursued since day one of this conflict. It was through the hard work of diplomacy that we opened the gates of Rafah to the first trucks carrying assistance. It was through the hard work of diplomacy that the parties reached an agreement to release more than 100 hostages and surge aid into Gaza through an extended pause in November. And it was through the hard work of diplomacy that we will create the conditions for a sustainable cessation of hostilities as we call for it in Resolution 2720. Colleagues, a sustainable cessation will reunite the hostages with their loved ones, and it will allow critical humanitarian assistance to reach Palestinians in need. The United States has been working tirelessly with Qatar, Egypt, and other regional partners to reach an agreement that would see the hostages come home. Hostages, this Council has repeatedly urged Hamas and other groups to release, and who the court agrees should be freed immediately and unconditionally. The proposal on the table is strong, and it is compelling. It envisions a much longer humanitarian pause than we saw in November, and it would allow for us to get the hostages out and more life-saving food, water, and medicine into Gaza. These are extremely sensitive negotiations, so I will not go into all the details here, but I think we can all agree that this would change the situation on the ground. It would move the parties one step closer to the sustainable cessation of hostilities that we all desire. Colleagues, Hamas set this conflict in motion on October 7th when it carried out the deadliest attack against Jews since the Holocaust. It now has a choice to make. It can continue to dig tunnels, to plan for its next attack, to use civilians and civilian infrastructure as human shields, or Hamas can lay down its weapons and accept the proposal on the table to release every hostage. We all have an obligation to ensure that any action this Council takes in the coming days increases pressure on Hamas to make the right decision. Of course, for this proposal to successfully change the dynamics for the better, the UN must be situated to dramatically expand the provision of assistance. The disturbing and, according to the Secretary General, credible allegations that 12 UNRWA employees were involved in Hamas's October 7th attack on Israel have shaken confidence in UNRWA at a moment that calls for scaled-up humanitarian assistance. The United States appreciates the seriousness with which the Secretary General has approached these allegations. Terminating the employment contracts of the involved personnel was a crucial first step, and we know the Secretary General has pledged to pursue further accountability, including comprehensive, independent review of UNRWA. This investigation needs to be swift, thorough, and credible. Colleagues, the United States has long been the leading donor of UNRWA. We know that this agency provides life-saving services under incredibly challenging circumstances in Gaza, and it contributes to regional stability and security through its work in the West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. For this reason, and for the sake of the millions of Palestinian civilians who depend on UNRWA's services, it is vital that the UN take quick and decisive action to hold accountable anyone guilty of heinous actions and to strengthen oversight of UNRWA's operations and begin to restore donor confidence. The United States' decision to temporarily pause our funding for UNRWA was made independently from other donors. Let me be clear, it was not a punitive measure, but it is a wake-up call. We need to see fundamental changes at UNRWA to prevent this from happening again. Colleagues, the last months have been nothing short of devastating, but I hope this moment in which the international community has united behind Special Coordinator Cog can be galvanizing. We have much more diplomacy ahead of us, but the path to begin de-escalating this conflict, to begin laying the foundation for a durable peace, is clear. That is what Israelis and Palestinians deserve, a two-state solution in which both live side by side with equal measure of peace, security, and dignity. And let us all commit to making that vision a reality. Thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie la représentante des États-Unis de sa déclaration et je donne maintenant la parole à la représentante de Guyana.
Madam President, Guyana expresses its appreciation to the delegation of Algeria for requesting this meeting and to USG Griffiths for his briefing. We meet for the fourth time this month on the Palestinian question. Each briefing brings reports of more lives lost and an ever-worsening situation in Gaza. We remain deeply concerned about the prevailing humanitarian situation and the continuing death and destruction that have enveloped the landscape of Gaza since the fateful events of 7th October. Guyana has unequivocally condemned the October 7th attacks on Israel. We call again for the release of all hostages held in Gaza. We also call for the release of Palestinians unlawfully detained in Israeli prisons without trial. Madam President, following developments in the war and listening to the briefings by UN agencies, including what we heard today from USG Griffiths, one may be moved to wonder whether a bounty exists on the head of every Palestinian child, man, and woman. Many of those who have managed to escape the bombs and bullets face the dire prospect of death from starvation or disease. Can the Council keep silent in these circumstances? Of course not. The international community, and this Council in particular, must spare no effort to end this cycle of bloodshed. Madam President, it was distressing to learn that 12 of the 13,000 UNRWA staffers were alleged to have been involved in the 7th October attack against Israel. We look forward to the conclusion of the UN's investigations into the matter and to appropriate action being taken. On this note, Madam President, we are concerned that several countries have halted their funding to UNRWA on account of these allegations. UNRWA is indispensable to the people of Gaza and has for decades offered a lifeline for Palestinians. With the current unprecedented situation in Gaza, UNRWA cannot afford to lose a single penny. We look forward to a prompt resolution in the interest of the continued unhindered flow of much-needed humanitarian support to the people in Gaza. Madam President, Guyana maintains that a ceasefire is the first and most important step at this stage to halt the death and destruction in the Gaza Strip. We hope for a positive outcome of ongoing efforts by regional and other actors. The provisional measures granted by the ICJ last Friday are clear. The killing of Palestinians must stop. Bodily and mental harm to Palestinians must stop. Deliberately inflicting conditions calculated to bring about physical destruction, in whole or in part, must stop. Guyana urges strict adherence to international law, including international humanitarian law, and underscores the obligation of UN member states in this respect. Madam President, the ultimate remedy to this continuing cycle of crises is the full implementation of the two-state solution as outlined in various UN resolutions. Guyana looks forward to a new day for Palestinians and Israelis beyond the constant shadows of war. We are prepared to work with this Council and the entire UN membership to accelerate the vision of two independent states living side by side in peace and security, and of a peaceful Middle East. I thank you.
Je remercie la représentante de Guyana de sa déclaration et je donne maintenant la parole à la représentante du Royaume-Uni.
Thank you, President. And I join others in thanking Under Secretary General Griffiths for his powerful briefing. On the 7th of October, Israel suffered the worst terror attack in their history at the hands of Hamas. The UK wants to see the hostages taken on that day released as soon as possible, and an end to the fighting in Gaza as soon as possible. The humanitarian situation is desperate. We are calling for an immediate suspension of fighting in order to get vital aid in and hostages out that progresses towards a permanent, sustainable ceasefire without a return to destruction, fighting, and loss of life. We continue to work intensively with the UN and all partners on practical solutions to get more aid into Gaza. During his visit to the region last week, my Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron, again pressed Israel to allow unhindered humanitarian access. We're supporting the World Food Programme to deliver a humanitarian land corridor from Jordan into Gaza, and the UK has trebled our humanitarian aid commitment to the occupied Palestinian territories this year. The UK continues to engage closely with Israel on the conduct of their military campaign, including on IHL, and to call for Israel to take greater care to avoid harming civilians and civilian infrastructure. The UK respects the role and independence of the ICJ. We welcome the ICJ's call for the immediate release of hostages and the need to get more aid into Gaza, as well as the court's reminder that all parties to the conflict are bound by international humanitarian law. It is for the court, not countries, to determine genocide. Nevertheless, we were troubled by the way in which this action was taken, and we've made our views about this very clear. As Lord Cameron said in the Middle East last week, echoed in the Minister of State Lord Ahmed's intervention at the Security Council also last week, we believe the following 5 steps are vital. First, a political horizon which provides a credible and irreversible pathway towards a two-state solution. Second, the formation of a new Palestinian government for the West Bank and Gaza, accompanied by an international support package. Third, removing Hamas capacity to launch attacks against Israel. Fourth, the release of all Israeli hostages. And finally, Hamas no longer in charge of Gaza. As my Foreign Secretary has said, it is only when the prize of peace is more attractive than the potential benefit of continued conflict that we will have the chance of a better future for Israelis and Palestinians. Thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie la représentante du Royaume-Uni de sa déclaration et je donne maintenant la parole à la représentante de la Suisse.
Merci, Madame la Présidente, et merci d'avoir convoqué cette séance. Et je voudrais, comme mes collègues, remercier aussi le secrétaire général adjoint aux affaires humanitaires, M. Martin Griffiths, non seulement de sa présentation, mais aussi pour le travail de ses équipes et de lui-même. Au vu du bilan accablant de ce conflit en vie humaine, du niveau de destruction à Gaza et des violences en Cisjordanie, je rappelle ici l'obligation de toutes les parties de respecter le droit international humanitaire et les droits humains. Nous l'avons entendu du secrétaire général adjoint, la situation humanitaire à Gaza est catastrophique. La population s'y trouve aujourd'hui sans la protection dont elle a besoin et à laquelle elle a droit. Elle est assiégée, en proie aux bombardements et combats, aux déplacements répétés, à la famine et aux épidémies. Tout cela alors que le secteur de santé, et nous venons de l'entendre, est en ruine, malgré les efforts courageux des acteurs et actrices humanitaires. Cela ne peut continuer. La mise en place d'un cessez-le-feu humanitaire doit permettre l'accès rapide, sûr et sans entrave de l'aide humanitaire à la population civile dans le besoin, par tous les moyens et tous les points de passage possibles, ainsi que la libération immédiate et inconditionnelle de l'ensemble des otages, conformément au droit international humanitaire. Je réitère le plein soutien de mon pays à la Cour internationale de justice. Les mesures conservatoires de la Cour sont contraignantes pour les parties. La Suisse attend d'Israël qu'il se conforme à son ordonnance et prenne notamment les mesures nécessaires afin de prévenir la commission de tout acte de génocide et de toute incitation de le commettre. Parmi les mesures indiquées figurent également des mesures effectives à prendre sans délai pour permettre la fourniture des services de base et de l'aide humanitaire requis de toute urgence afin de remédier aux difficiles conditions d'existence auxquelles sont soumis les Palestiniens de la bande de Gaza. En Cisjordanie, les attaques de colons contre les Palestiniens et le déplacement forcé de communautés entières qui en résultent sont inacceptables, et ce dans un environnement d'impunité presque complète. En tant que puissance occupante, Israël doit s'abstenir de prendre des mesures qui introduiraient des changements permanents dans le territoire palestinien. Nous saluons la visite qui est en cours en Israël et en Cisjordanie de Madame la représentante spéciale Pramila Patten. Le rapport qu'elle prévoit de présenter sur les violences sexuelles commises durant et depuis les attaques du 7 octobre, que nous avons fermement condamnées, pourra nous donner une vue plus globale de la situation catastrophique. La Suisse appelle à ce que des enquêtes indépendantes soient menées sur toutes les allégations de violation du droit international commises en Israël et dans l'ensemble du territoire palestinien occupé. Leurs auteurs présumés doivent être traduits en justice auprès des instances pertinentes. Enfin, nous sommes extrêmement préoccupés par les allégations très graves à l'encontre de 12 employés de l'UNRWA soupçonnés d'avoir participé aux actes de terreur du 7 octobre, alors que l'UNRWA est le plus grand acteur humanitaire dans la bande de Gaza actuellement, fournissant de l'aide à 2 millions de personnes. Mon pays a une tolérance zéro pour tout soutien au terrorisme et tout appel à la haine ou incitation à la violence. Nous avons pris bonne note des mesures immédiates prises par l'UNRWA à l'encontre des employés et attendons de l'enquête interne qu'elle fasse toute la lumière sur ces graves allégations. Madame la Présidente, il est urgent de mettre fin à la crise humanitaire en cours à Gaza et de parvenir le plus rapidement possible à une désescalade au niveau régional. Les signaux se font toujours plus inquiétants, notamment des deux côtés de la ligne bleue entre Israël et le Liban. Au-delà, les tensions sont vives au Yémen, en Syrie, en Irak et dans la mer Rouge. Ce Conseil doit assumer ses responsabilités. Comme elle l'a fait jusqu'à présent, la Suisse est disponible pour travailler à une action concertée du Conseil allant dans ce sens. Les éléments que j'ai mentionnés, le respect du droit international, y compris la mise en place d'un cessez-le-feu humanitaire, l'accès de l'aide à Gaza, la libération des otages, ne sont que des premiers pas vers une résolution politique de ce conflit. La Suisse se tient prête à soutenir les efforts à même de reconstruire l'espoir de paix à travers une solution à 2 États démocratiques qui vivent côte à côte en paix à l'intérieur de frontières sûres et reconnues, avec Gaza comme partie intégrante d'un futur État palestinien. Je vous remercie.
Je remercie la représentante de la Suisse de sa déclaration et je donne maintenant la parole au représentant du Mozambique.
Madam President, Mozambique commends the French presidency for having convened this briefing on the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. We extend our appreciation to Mr. Martin Griffiths, Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, for his insightful and moving update to the Council. We praise him and his team, both in the field and at the headquarters, for their hard work and extraordinary service to the Palestinian people and to the humanitarian cause around the world. Madam President, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is a matter of great concern to the Council and to the international community as a whole. It has been aptly described as a humanitarian catastrophe. As a consequence, there is an urgent need for global action to protect and safeguard the lives and dignity of Palestinian civilians amidst unprecedented adversity. We are informed of intense fights in southwest of Gaza over the last days, causing more loss of lives and damage to civilian infrastructure. The recent reports from Gaza reveal an unprecedented hunger crisis. Therefore, the prospect of a widespread famine has become a deep concern in the humanitarian calamity in Gaza. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency has warned us that the situation is further deteriorating following funding cuts. The suspension of funding by some donors will further negatively impact life-saving assistance for over 2 million civilians, over half of them are children. They rely solely on UNRWA aid in Gaza. UNRWA is the primary humanitarian agency assisting over 2 million people in Gaza in these difficult times. We therefore call for immediate measures to be taken to ensure that humanitarian assistance funds continue reaching millions of civilians in extreme need in Gaza. In war as in humanitarian assistance, we need to reassert our firm solidarity with the suffering people of Palestine and oppose the withdrawing or suspending the much needed aid to UNRWA under any pretext. Mr. President, on January 26, 2024, the International Court of Justice, the principal judicial organ of the United Nations, took a momentous decision. It ordered Israel to take immediate and effective measures to enable the provision of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance to address the adverse conditions of life faced by the Palestinian people in Gaza. The ICJ also ordered Israel to refrain from acts under the Genocide Convention, to prevent and punish the direct and public incitement to genocide, and preserve evidence of genocide and submit a report to the court within 1 month of all measures taken in line with the court's order. The heart of the court's decision is to protect the Palestinian people in the occupied Gaza Strip from indiscriminate killing, harm, and elimination in whole or in part. In the order of the court, and I quote, Israel must, in accordance with its obligations under the Genocide Convention, in relation to Palestinians in Gaza, take all measures within its power to prevent the commission of all acts within the scope of Article 2 of this convention. In addition, and I quote again, the court further considers that Israel must take immediate and effective measures to enable the provision of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance to address the adverse conditions of life faced by Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. End of quote. I was quoting the International Court of Justice. As a matter of fact, the court decision gives credence and substance to the appeal made by this council for an immediate and sustained humanitarian pause and cessation of hostilities when we unanimously adopted Security Council resolutions 2712 and 2720, as stated here by the distinguished representative of the United States of America. We believe the two principal organs of the United Nations established by the Charter, that is to say the Security Council and the International Court of Justice, are fully aligned in the fundamental interest of protecting Palestinians in Gaza. The court further reminds us that its orders on provisional measures are binding and they create international obligations to those they are addressed to. It is our hope that both the court's ruling and the Security Council resolutions on the matter are fully respected and implemented in good faith by Israel and by all members of the United Nations. Mr. President, the conflict in Gaza has the potential to cause far-reaching political and security consequences. The conflict is already having economic and security ripples that threaten international peace and security and stability. At our last meeting in this chamber, we reminded of the need for us to be cautious and prudent in every move we make and in every step that we take in order not to further jeopardize global peace and security. An immediate and urgent humanitarian ceasefire and the cessation of hostilities are therefore a sine qua non factors to ensure that humanitarian aid is delivered without restriction to those in need in Gaza to allow for the release of all hostages and the peace process in the region to make substantive progress. We therefore reiterate our call for this Council to stand united in the support of actions and initiatives that aim to address and reverse the calamitous situation in Gaza. Je vous remercie, Madame la Présidente.
Je remercie le représentant du Mozambique de sa déclaration et je donne la parole au représentant de Sierra Leone.
Madam President, thank you for convening this meeting. I also thank the mission of Algeria for requesting this meeting today. I'll join others to express our thanks to Under Secretary General Martin Griffiths for his detailed briefing to this Council. Since the 7th October 2023 atrocious attack by Hamas against Israel, we have witnessed several interventions by United Nations and the international community to find a path that will ensure the rescuing of 1.7 million civilians in the Gaza Strip, caught in the most appalling humanitarian situation, and also ensure the release of the remaining 136 hostages held by Hamas with limited access and information about their well-being. We welcome the initial briefing of the Security Council by Sigrid Kaag, Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza, and look forward to the establishment of a UN mechanism that will accelerate the delivery of humanitarian consignments to the Gaza Strip that will ensure the right quantity and quality of assistance to reach the vulnerable people in a timely and a sustained manner. As we continue our engagement as a Council in finding an immediate solution to ongoing hostilities and the deteriorating humanitarian situation, and given recent developments, my delegation would like to state the following. Reflecting upon the ruling of the International Court of Justice on the provisional measures on South Africa's application instituting proceedings against the State of Israel, my delegation is of the view that parties to the conflict must comply with such measures as they are obligated under international law. We welcome the court's ruling that, quote, Israel must take immediate and effective measures to enable the provision of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance to address the adverse humanitarian conditions of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, end of quote. My delegation remains deeply concerned about the persistent hostilities in the Gaza Strip, accounting for the tragic death of about 26,000 Palestinian civilians, 64,000 injured, and more than 1.7 million internally displaced. Considering all that is stated in the provisional measures and the updates received thus far, Sierra Leone believes that a humanitarian ceasefire is therefore most critical at this point if lives are to be saved, access to humanitarian aid facilitated, displacement controlled, and hunger and the spread of disease minimized. We note with serious concern the report of alleged involvement of certain UNRWA personnel in the 7th October 2023 Hamas attack on Israel, for which an investigation has been activated. While we await the report of the findings, we urge member states to continue with their financial assistance and provision of humanitarian supply to UNRWA, which is essential for the survival of the Palestinians in dire need. Sierra Leone continues to reiterate its condemnation of the 7th October 2023 unjustifiable and heinous attack on Israeli civilians and the taking of hostages. We therefore repeat our call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, and as an immediate action for access to be granted to the ICRC to visit the hostages and offer the necessary support. We therefore urge all parties to the conflict to honor their obligations under international law, especially international humanitarian law, to protect civilians and civilian objects, specifically women, children, and humanitarian personnel. In closing, Madam President, my delegation remains fully committed to supporting any initiative aimed at addressing this conflict and revamping the political process that transcends the immediate challenges and creates the path to a just, comprehensive, and lasting peace in the region based on the two-state solution. Thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de Sierra Leone de sa déclaration et je donne maintenant la parole au représentant de l'Équateur.
Gracias, Presidenta. Agradezco al Secretario General Adjunto de Asuntos Humanitarios, Martin Griffiths, por el informe que nos acaba de proporcionar. El Ecuador valora sus esfuerzos y reitera su permanente apoyo a sus labores. Como hemos escuchado, la situación humanitaria continúa siendo muy difícil, precaria. Este Consejo, a través de las resoluciones 2712 y 2720, ha requerido la provisión suficiente y oportuna de ayuda humanitaria y ha dispuesto la creación de un mecanismo que haga más fácil y rápido su ingreso y distribución en Gaza. La Coordinadora Superior de Asuntos Humanitarios y de la Reconstrucción, nombrada para el efecto, ha iniciado sus labores y ha presentado al Consejo un primer informe el día de ayer. Deseamos una vez más a Sigrid Kaag el mayor de los éxitos. Para cumplir con el mandato encomendado, sin embargo, no son suficientes las expresiones de respaldo. Es indispensable que tenga los recursos necesarios y la colaboración de las partes en el conflicto. La resolución 2720 del Consejo así lo exige. La adopción de medidas inmediatas que garanticen la provisión de servicios básicos y ayuda humanitaria ha sido también dispuesta a Israel por la Corte Internacional de Justicia en las medidas provisionales decididas la semana pasada. Asimismo, la Corte ha determinado otras 4 medidas provisionales, entre ellas la necesidad de prevenir y castigar la incitación pública a cometer genocidio en relación con la población palestina en Gaza. Las resoluciones del Consejo de Seguridad y las órdenes de la Corte Internacional de Justicia deben ser respetadas, siempre, sin excepción, en este y en todos los casos. Señora Presidenta, una vez más, el Ecuador condena enérgicamente los ataques terroristas de Hamás del pasado 7 de octubre. En los últimos días, hemos conocido con mucha preocupación las acusaciones de que 12 funcionarios de la UNRWA habían participado en esos ataques terroristas. Al respecto, felicitamos la rápida respuesta de Naciones Unidas. Esperamos que las investigaciones en curso permitan determinar lo sucedido tan pronto como sea posible. Y sobre todo, que se rindan cuentas ante la justicia por las responsabilidades individuales que existan. El peso de la ley debe caer a quienes hubieran cometido estos crímenes o colaborado con quienes los cometieron. Al mismo tiempo, recordamos que más de 150 funcionarios de la misma UNRWA han muerto como consecuencia de la guerra, que la labor de la UNRWA es de vital importancia para aliviar la situación de la población civil en Gaza y en otras zonas del Medio Oriente, y que la continuidad de sus operaciones es crucial para mantener la estabilidad de la región. Una eventual suspensión de las actividades de la UNRWA con seguridad afectaría también a la labor encomendada a la Coordinadora Superior Kaag y a la implementación de las resoluciones 2712 y 2720. Señora Presidenta, colegas, el Ecuador no ha olvidado a los rehenes aprehendidos por Hamás y otros grupos que aún no recuperan su libertad. Insistimos en exigir que todos ellos sean liberados inmediatamente y sin condición alguna. Se ha conocido que están en curso negociaciones para la liberación de rehenes y un cese prolongado, ojalá definitivo, de las hostilidades. El éxito de esas negociaciones sería un paso muy positivo e importante. El Ecuador valora y apoya los esfuerzos de quienes están involucrados en ellas y de todos los actores que de una u otra forma contribuyen a mejorar la situación humanitaria y hasta restablecer la paz. Finalmente, mi país reitera su compromiso de trabajar hacia una solución pacífica, definitiva y justa para las partes, con la existencia de 2 estados, Palestina e Israel, sobre la base de las fronteras de 1967 y de las resoluciones relevantes. Muchas gracias, señora Presidenta.
Je remercie le représentant de l'Équateur de sa déclaration et je donne la parole au représentant de Slovénie.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I would also like to start thanking the Secretary General Griffiths for his briefing. With each briefing that the Security Council receives, the already devastating situation in Gaza is turning to worse. My minister spoke in this chamber last week at length about the need for a ceasefire in order to stop the human suffering, to deliver humanitarian assistance, to bring hostages home, to secure Gaza and Israel from attacks and destruction, to devise a plan for a political solution of two states, and so on. We appreciate efforts of all states and leaders who are trying to secure a humanitarian pause leading to a lasting cessation of hostilities. We need that pause now. Madam President, today I would like to reflect on two topics that are at the forefront of discussions with regard to Gaza these days: respect for international law and situation around UNRWA. Slovenia has been and will continue being a strong supporter of international law. Respect for international law and a strong international legal system are the best guarantees for maintaining international peace and security. This is what we understand under the term rule-based international order that we often like to invoke. Unwavering commitment to international law includes respect for and compliance with the decisions of international courts and tribunals. Slovenia welcomes the ICJ order in the case of South Africa against Israel, indicating provisional measures. Court's orders are final and binding, and we therefore expect and call for swift and full implementation of the order. We further echo Court's concern about the fate of the hostages abducted during the attack on 7 October, and we once again call for their immediate release and for granting the ICRC access to them. Slovenia would like to underline Court's independence and voice our clear and strong support for its work. In relation to the provisional measures, we would like to emphasize that obligations under the Convention are of erga omnes partes nature, and all state parties to the Convention have a legal interest in ensuring compliance with its provisions. This includes Court's order to enable the provisions of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance. As members of the Security Council, we carry additional responsibility for the implementation of the order. Madam President, since its inception in 1949, UNRWA, or United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, has been a lifeline to millions of Palestinians in diverse areas of its assistance: education, healthcare, relief and social services, camp infrastructure and improvement, microfinance and emergency assistance, including in times of armed conflict. By providing services and administrating its installations, UNRWA has been a signal of hope and provider of essentials to generations of Palestinian refugees in Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. Many of its staff lost their lives while serving the agency and the UN. Let me express our deep concern over allegations that a number of Gazans employed by UNRWA were associated with the horrific Hamas attack on the 7th of October. Slovenia welcomes a prompt response by the Secretary General and the UNRWA Commissioner General to conduct internal and independent investigations, as well as an audit requested by the EU regarding the allegations. We are looking forward to swift results of the investigations and recommendations how to improve work of the agency. At the same time, Slovenia underlines its continuous support for the important work of UNRWA as a lifeline for millions of people in Gaza and beyond. UNRWA is the largest humanitarian organization in Gaza, and there is no viable substitute for its work in Gaza. Their operation in the next weeks and months is vital for the implementation of the ICJ order on provisional measures. Thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de la Slovénie de sa déclaration et je donne maintenant la parole au représentant du Japon.
Thank you, Madam President. I also thank USG Griffiths for his briefing. Madam President, last Friday, the International Court of Justice delivered its order on the provisional measures regarding the application of the Genocide Convention in the Gaza Strip. Without a final determination on whether Israel is in violation of the Genocide Convention for the present time, the ICJ ordered inter alia that Israel shall take measures to prevent genocide and its incitement and to enable the provision of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance. The order on the provisional measures of the ICJ, the principal international judicial organ of the United Nations, is legally binding on the parties to the dispute. Therefore, it is to be observed in good faith. What matters most is whether we can make a difference on the ground by seizing every momentum. Japan has been continuing its sincere diplomatic efforts to improve the current catastrophic humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. We need to continue to address various challenges on the ground in a holistic manner. The ICJ also emphasizes all the parties to the conflict in Gaza Strip are bound by international humanitarian law, and the court is gravely concerned about the fate of the hostages taken by Hamas and others, calling for their immediate and unconditional release. Japan loudly echoes this point and once again unequivocally condemns the barbaric acts of terror by Hamas and others. We also urge Israel to comply with international law, including international humanitarian law, in exercising its right to defend itself and its people. Madam President, 1 year ago, in January 2023, Japan convened an open debate on the rule of law as President of the Security Council for the month. The essence of the rule of law is no one is above the law. Therefore, everyone must comply with the law. This is one of the core universal principles of the international community, and international peace and security can never be maintained without the observance of international law in good faith. This includes respecting the UN Charter, Security Council resolutions, international humanitarian law, and obviously orders and judgments of the ICJ. In this regard, it is deeply regrettable that not all rulings of the international courts have been respected by some countries. To achieve peace based on the rule of law, every country must abide by international law and sincerely observe the decisions of international courts, whether one likes them or not. Our commitment to the rule of Madam President, together with the two recent Security Council resolutions, 2712 and 2720, Japan urges all parties to comply with the international law, thereby escalating the situation towards a possible ceasefire, which could pave the way for a lasting peace. Despite the seemingly hopeless of the current moment, we firmly believe the two-state solution, where Israel and the future independent Palestinian state live side by side in peace and dignity, remains the only viable path for both peoples. Japan will continue to spare no effort to help realize this goal. Lastly, I need to touch upon one of the biggest challenges of the moment concerning humanitarian situation in Gaza. Japan is extremely concerned about the alleged involvement of UNRWA staff members in the terror attack on Israel on October 7 last year. We are cognizant many UNRWA staff members have been dedicated to providing essential humanitarian assistance to Gaza, and more than 150 staff sacrificed themselves. Japan strongly urges the UN and the UNRWA to conduct an investigation in a prompt and complete manner and to take appropriate measures, including strengthening governance within the UNRWA, so that the UNRWA can firmly fulfill the role it should play. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant du Japon de cette déclaration et je donne la parole au représentant de la République de Corée.
Thank you, Madam President. I also thank USG Martin Griffiths for his briefing. Indeed, humanitarian crisis is deepening day by day before our eyes. My delegation would like to reiterate the Republic of Korea's full and continuing support for the humanitarian activities of the United Nations, including those of the recently appointed senior the Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator, Sigrid Kaag. Madam President, I'd like to affirm that the Republic of Korea respects the role of the ICJ as the principal judicial organ of the United Nations and takes note of the order issued by the ICJ on the 26th of January regarding South Africa's request for the indication of provisional measures. It is to be noted that the Council did not ascertain whether any violations of the obligations under the Genocide Convention have occurred. It was about whether the circumstances require the indication of provisional measures, as the ICJ duly pointed out. The Court also noted that its orders on provisional measures have binding effect. We strongly hope that Israel will, in accordance with the order, take immediate and effective measures, particularly to enable the provision of humanitarian assistance to Palestinians in Gaza. As emphasized by the ICJ, all parties to the armed conflict are bound by international humanitarian law. In this context, Hamas and other groups must immediately release all hostages without preconditions. Moreover, all terrorist attacks and sexual violence committed by Hamas on the 7th of October must be unambiguously condemned and fully investigated, and perpetrators must be held accountable. Last week, this Council held an open debate on the situation in Gaza, and the vast majority of the participants, including my delegation at the meeting, reiterated their calls for expanded humanitarian assistance, the protection of civilians, and the concrete steps to realize the two-state solution. The ICJ provisional measures must serve as a deterrence to any further deterioration of the already dreadful situation in Gaza. The Republic of Korea will continue to closely monitor the case as it proceeds. Madam President, for decades, the Republic of Korea has maintained amicable relationships with both Israel and Palestine. The diplomatic relations between the Republic of Korea and Israel date back to more than 6 decades ago. Meanwhile, we have strongly committed to the two-state solution in accordance with the aspirations of Palestinians and have provided a substantial amount of humanitarian and development assistance for Palestine and Palestinian refugees for many years. And our contributions to UNRWA this year quadrupled compared to last year. Madam President, it is heartbreaking to see the cycle of extreme violence and ever-deepening mistrust between our two friends, Israel and Palestine. As we now bear witness to the unprecedented catastrophe in Gaza, we all understand that it is high time to end the ongoing enmity in Israel and Palestine, which has resulted in unfathomable misery, sorrow, fear, anger, and indignity in this region. Of course, finding a resolution to this conflict has been a tall order. This is why the Security Council, with the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, must act more proactively and aggressively to stop the ongoing conflict and chart the path forward. based on the strong common ground shared by the vast majority of UN member states, as expressed at the open debate last week. As Secretary General Guterres reiterated at the debate, a lasting end to this conflict can only come through a two-state solution, and we believe that a humanitarian ceasefire can serve as a vital foundation, not only to expand humanitarian assistance to Palestinians in Gaza, but also to resume sincere negotiations to realize the two-state solution. I thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie le représentant de la République de Corée de sa déclaration et je donne maintenant la parole au représentant de la Chine.
谢谢主席女士。主席女士，我首先感谢阿尔及利亚倡议召开本次会议，感谢格里菲斯副秘书长刚才所做的通报。本轮巴以冲突爆发已经3个多月了，战火仍在燃烧，人道灾难仍在加剧。面对国际法和国际人道法屡屡遭到践踏，面对人类尊严、道义和良知的底线一次次被突破，面对地区和平安全面临巨大威胁，国际社会的呼声日益强烈。国际法院也已采取有力行动，安理会别无选择，必须以最大的责任感、最坚定的决心，迅速采取进一步有力行动，维护正义，拯救生命，实现和平。我们必须最大的紧迫感推动立即停火。国际社会对立即实现停火早有压倒性共识，遗憾的是个别国家一味消极阻挠，军事手段无法实现真正的安全，加沙战事延宕只会导致更多的人员死亡，更大范围的地区动荡，让中东和平更加遥遥无期。安理会应采取有力行动，把全部外交努力汇聚到推动立即停火上来。以色列应立即停止对加沙地区无差别的军事进攻和毁坏，同时要全力防止加沙冲突对红海等更广泛地区的外溢影响。我们呼吁各方保持冷静克制，避免采取加剧局势紧张的行动。我们必须采取务实行动，缓解人道灾难。加沙的人道灾难前所未有，世卫组织总干事已发出警告，加沙的生存条件犹如地狱。安理会第2712号、2720号2项决议必须得到全面落实。以色列必须全面配合，停止对物资准入的层层设障，开放全部陆海空准入通道，切实保障人道机构和工作人员安全。我们支持安理会采取进一步行动，为人道救援扫清障碍。国际法院上周发布临时措施命令，这是对国际社会关于保护平民、推动地区局势降温、缓解加沙人道危机普遍关切的有力回应。临时措施命令应该得到迅速、有效执行。我们必须坚定不移推动落实两国方案。落实两国方案是实现巴以和平的唯一可行出路。以色列必须立即停止侵蚀两国方案基础，停止针对加沙民众的强制转移，停止在约旦河西岸扩建定居点，停止 针对巴勒斯坦人的搜查、搜捕和袭击。中方呼吁加大国际和地区外交努力，重塑可信多边进程，倡议召开更具规模、更大范围、更有实效的国际和会，尽快推动形成落实两国方案的时间表和路线图。我们支持巴勒斯坦成为联合国正式会员国。主席女士，我们注意到有关UNRWA员工参与10月7日袭击的指控，支持联合国开展独立、公正、客观的调查。同时必须指出，有关个案不应分散对加沙局势的关注和推动实现停火、缓解人道灾难的努力。UNRWA 为缓解加沙人道灾难发挥了不可或缺、无法替代的重要作用，是加沙200万民众活下去的希望。我们绝不能因为个别人的行为就全盘否定UNRWA的工作，在最需要的时候中断对UNRWA的支持，切断加沙民众的生命线，进而导致对巴勒斯坦人民的额外集体惩罚。我们呼吁国际社会，特别是主要捐款国，以加沙民众生命为重，以人道救援大局为重，重新考虑停止供资的决定，在调查期间继续支持UNRWA的工作。谢谢主席。
Je remercie le représentant de la Chine de sa déclaration et je donne la parole au représentant de la Fédération de Russie.
Госпожа председатель, благодарим Мартина Гриффитса за объективные оценки катастрофической ситуации в секторе Газа. Российская Федерация поддержала инициативу Алжира по созыву сегодняшнего заседания Совета по положению в зоне Палестино-израильского конфликта. Конфликт длится уже почти 4 месяца. Колоссальные цифры потерь и разрушений, которые мы все знаем, говорят сами за себя. Более 26 тысяч человек, включая женщин и детей, стали жертвами неизбирательных бомбардировок и силовых действий военных. По меньшей мере 65 тысяч человек получили ранения. 80% всего населения сектора стали внутренне перемещенными лицами. Ввиду отсутствия беспрепятственного гуманитарного доступа на север анклава и в его южные районы, прежде всего в Хан-Юнис, где израильские военные 8-й день подряд осаждают больницу Аль-Амаль, а также масштабного уничтожения объектов гражданской инфраструктуры, по сведениям, до 50%. Над Газой нависли не менее смертельные угрозы голода и эпидемии инфекционных заболеваний. Руководство ООН на всех уровнях в один голос твердит об императиве срочного и повсеместного прекращения огня в качестве обязательного условия налаживания гуманитарного содействия в необходимом масштабе. Со своей стороны последовательно и неизменно выступаем за немедленное гуманитарное прекращение огня. При этом речь, конечно, в первую очередь идет о секторе Газа, но и силовые рейды вооруженных сил Израиля на западном берегу реки Иордан, а кадры штурма госпиталя в населенном пункте Дженин облетели уже весь мир, наравне с обстрелами на голубой линии с Ливаном и произвольными ударами по территории Сирии, нужно остановить безотлагательно. Ведь без прекращения боевых действий невозможны ни полноценный гуманитарный доступ ко всем нуждающимся, ни освобождение всех заложников, ни реанимация процесса палестино-израильского урегулирования на международно признанной основе. Мы неоднократно публично заявляли, что атака против Израиля 7 октября, в ходе которой погибли мирные израильтяне, заслуживает всяческого осуждения. Но она не может и не должна становиться оправданием для коллективного наказания миллионов палестинцев и действий, рискующих дестабилизировать весь регион Ближнего Востока. Госпожа председатель, на этом трагическом гуманитарном фоне резонансным стало решение ряда западных доноров во главе с США приостановить финансирование БАПОР в связи с подозрением причастности его сотрудников к атаке 7 октября. В этом контексте разделяем позицию руководства секретариата о важности проведения тщательного и транспарентного расследования выдвинутых обвинений. Важно при этом, чтобы учитывались не только сведения, поступающие из Израиля, но и информация от палестинцев. Однако эта ситуация не должна становиться поводом для коллективного наказания миллионов нуждающихся палестинцев и тысяч сотрудников агентства, добросовестно выполнявших и выполняющих свои обязанности на протяжении 75 лет. Подозрения в отношении 12 бапоровцев не могут и не должны использоваться для дискредитации всей структуры агентства и подрыва его ключевой и безальтернативной деятельности по оказанию поддержки почти 6 миллионам палестинцев на ОПТ и в соседних арабских странах. Руководство ОПОР заявило, что в условиях приостановки финансирования со стороны ключевых доноров решение, мотивация которого вызывает у нас целый ряд вопросов, агентство, которое и так испытывает хроническое недофинансирование, не сможет работать в секторе Газа и в регионе в целом после февраля сего года. Этого нельзя допустить. В складывающихся условиях особую тревогу вызывает провокационная риторика ряда представителей руководства Израиля, которые призывают не только к продолжению военной операции в секторе Газа, но и к ликвидации присутствия в анклаве Бапор и насильственному перемещению палестинцев из мест их постоянного проживания. Подобный сценарий не должен быть реализован ни при каких обстоятельствах. Следует также немедленно остановить приобретающий массовый характер насилия со стороны израильской армии и еврейских поселенцев на Сбри. Госпожа председатель, прискорбно, что в этих условиях Совет Безопасности ООН пока так и не смог принять ни одного продукта с требованием прекратить насилие из-за позиции одной делегации Соединенных Штатов, блокирующей все усилия и инициативы по остановке кровопролития на оккупированных территориях и предоставляющих Израилю карт-бланш на продолжение коллективного наказания палестинцев. В свою очередь, беспомощность Совета и его неспособность к исчерпывающим коллективным мерам приводит к тому, что нынешний виток насилия на ОПТ провоцирует расширение географии конфликта на весь регион. Агрессивные действия наших коллег по СБ, Соединенных Штатов и Великобритании в Красном море напоминают о худших временах варварских и незаконных натовских бомбардировок Югославии, Афганистана, Ирака, Ливии и Сирии. При этом бессовестно эксплуатируются тезисы о борьбе с терроризмом и так называемом праве на самооборону. Категорически осуждаем агрессию против Йемена, предпринятую без соответствующих санкций Совета Безопасности. В очередной раз подчеркиваем, что неправомерные и провокационные действия Вашингтона и Лондона представляют прямую угрозу международному миру и безопасности, подрывают миропорядок, основанный на верховенстве международного права и центральной роли ООН. При этом мы отмечаем активную позицию подавляющего большинства членов международного сообщества, не желающего молчаливо наблюдать за устроенной израильтянами под прикрытием Соединенных Штатов зачисткой территории Газа. Не остался в стороне и Международный суд ООН, который 26 января вынес решение о временных мерах, предписав Израилю, в том числе как оккупирующей державе, по сути, выполнить те обязательства, которые и без того лежат на этой стране в силу международного права. Госпожа председатель, принципиальные подходы Российской Федерации к нынешнему витку Палестины и израильского противостояния остаются прежними. Наше ключевое требование – это немедленное прекращение огня как необходимая мера для обеспечения беспрепятственного гуманитарного доступа ко всем нуждающимся и безусловного освобождения всех заложников. Кроме того, для нас очевидно, что спираль насилия в Газе и на Сбри будет повторяться до тех пор, пока не будет устранена лежащая в основе конфликта многолетняя несправедливость, и палестинский народ не реализует предусмотренные резолюциями Совета Безопасности Генеральной Ассамблеи право на создание своего независимого государства в границах 1967 года со столицей в Восточном Иерусалиме. Только такой сбалансированный, основанный на международном праве подход способен привести к устойчивому миру. Россия будет и впредь делать все возможное, чтобы способствовать стабилизации на Ближнем Востоке, продвигать процесс ближневосточного регулирования вместе со странами региона и в координации с другими добросовестными посредниками. Как и прежде, открыты к обсуждению соответствующих инициатив в рамках коллективной работы на площадке ООН. Благодарю вас.
Je remercie le représentant de la Fédération de Russie de sa déclaration et je donne maintenant la parole à la représentante de Malte.
Thank you, President. And I also thank Under-Secretary General Martin Griffiths for his sobering briefing. Malta is gravely concerned at the sustained and severe impact the conflict in Israel, Gaza, and the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory is having on the civilian populations and regional stability. A permanent ceasefire remains crucial, as it is the sole way to ensure an effective humanitarian response across Gaza, whilst also de-escalating tensions across the Middle East. Malta stresses that acts of terror are unjustifiable. We once again condemn the Hamas terror attacks on 7 October and the continued rocket fire at Israeli population centers. All hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally, in accordance with Security Council Resolution 2712. Furthermore, we are gravely concerned by reports of sexual violence perpetrated and call for them to be investigated. We are also concerned at the allegations concerning the involvement of UNRWA staff in the attacks. We welcome the Secretary General and the Commissioner General Lazzarini's swift action in this regard and anticipate the outcome of the investigation. Any staff members involved must be held accountable. We stress, however, that the role of UNRWA remains indispensable, particularly in Gaza during the current crisis. It is essential that UNRWA receives the funding it requires to assist civilians as one of the only humanitarian lifelines for over 2 million Palestinians trapped in Gaza. As we heard yesterday from Ms. Sigrid Kaag and today from Mr. Griffiths, the humanitarian situation in Gaza remains catastrophic. Death, destruction, disease, displacement, and the threat of famine have become the daily reality for millions of civilians, including hundreds of thousands of women and children. Only an urgent cessation of hostilities can provide the environment for a necessary, meaningful, and effective humanitarian response throughout the entirety of Gaza. We recall that all parties have a legal obligation as defined under international law, including international humanitarian law, to protect civilians. Israel is also required to facilitate the full, rapid, safe, and unimpeded delivery of humanitarian aid into Gaza, as is also articulated in Security Council Resolutions 2712 and 2720. Moreover, in the order on provisional measures issued by the International Court of Justice on 26 January on the prevention of the crime of genocide, the court stated that all measures must be taken by Israel to prevent the killing and causing bodily or mental harm of Palestinians in Gaza, and to enable the provision of basic services and humanitarian assistance to the Gaza Strip. Malta reaffirms its strong support to the role of the ICJ as the principal judicial organ of the multilateral order and underlines that its decisions are binding and must be respected. We expect the full, immediate, and effective implementation of the order. President, the threat of an intensification beyond Gaza has regrettably become a reality. In the occupied West Bank, continued intensified armed exchanges, military incursions, planned raids, settler violence, and mass detainment threaten to ignite further instability. Israeli settler violence must also be addressed and not allowed to continue with impunity. Malta reiterates that Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territory violate international law and relevant Security Council resolutions. We reject and denounce any forced displacement of Palestinians from their lands or homes, including from Gaza. President, building a credible foundation for future and security for both Israelis and Palestinians must include a legitimate, reinforced, and revitalized Palestinian Authority, allowing effective governance in line with the two-state solution, with Gaza as part of an independent Palestinian state. To conclude, Malta underscores its commitment to a lasting and sustainable peace in the Middle East, based on a two-state solution in line with the relevant Security Council resolutions and internationally agreed parameters. I thank you.
Je remercie la représentante de Malte de sa déclaration et je vais maintenant faire une déclaration en ma qualité de représentante de la France. Je remercie Martin Griffiths de son exposé. La France rappelle que les otages doivent être libérés immédiatement et sans condition et considère que ce Conseil doit être en mesure de condamner les attaques terroristes du 7 octobre commises par le Hamas et des groupes terroristes ainsi que les violences sexuelles et sexistes. À l'initiative de la France et d'autres pays européens, l'Union européenne a établi un régime de sanctions contre le Hamas. Sur le terrain, œuvrer immédiatement en faveur d'un cessez-le-feu durable est plus que jamais urgent. Israël doit se conformer au droit international humanitaire qui impose en tout temps, en tout lieu, des principes clairs de distinction, de nécessité, de proportionnalité et de précaution. Martin Griffiths l'a souligné, il est impératif de lever les obstacles pour garantir l'accès humanitaire et pour mettre pleinement en œuvre les résolutions 2712 et 2720 de ce Conseil. La France restera solidaire des Palestiniens de Gaza. Nos actions pour leur porter assistante sont concrètes. Fret et soins médicaux en coopération avec l'Égypte, fret humanitaire parachuté sur Gaza avec l'aide de la Jordanie. Les informations sur une participation d'agents de l'UNRWA aux attaques du 7 octobre sont extrêmement graves et les enquêtes lancées ces derniers jours doivent faire toute la lumière sur les faits passés, être assorties de mesures concrètes. La France n'avait pas prévu de nouveaux versements au premier semestre 2024 et elle décidera le moment venu de la conduite à tenir en s'assurant que toutes ces exigences de transparence et de sécurité de l'aide sont bien prises en compte. La France a pris note avec attention de la décision prise par la Cour internationale de justice qui porte sur des mesures conservatoires. La France est profondément attachée au respect du droit international et elle réaffirme toute sa confiance et son soutien à la Cour internationale de justice. Sur le plan politique, la solution des deux États est la seule qui puisse permettre de construire une paix juste et durable. Et il faut travailler à l'édification d'un État pour les Palestiniens. L'autorité palestinienne a un rôle central à jouer dans ce processus, en Cisjordanie comme à Gaza, qui a vocation à faire partie de cet État palestinien. Et la France condamne la politique de colonisation menée par Israël et les violences des colons en Cisjordanie. Nous condamnons aussi la tenue d'une conférence dimanche dernier à Jérusalem, promouvant l'installation de colonies à Gaza et le transfert de la population palestinienne de Gaza hors de ce territoire. Et nous rappelons que la Cour internationale de justice a énoncé l'obligation pour Israël de prendre toutes les mesures en son pouvoir pour prévenir et punir ce type de propos. Enfin, il est urgent d'éviter un embrasement régional. La stabilité du Liban et de la région nécessite le plein respect de la résolution 1701 par toutes les parties et avec l'aide de la FINUL. Et la France contribue à réunir les conditions d'une désescalade durable dans ce cadre. La France continuera à assumer ses responsabilités pour contribuer à la sécurité maritime en mer Rouge. Je vous remercie. Je reprends mes fonctions de président du Conseil Et je donne maintenant la parole à l'observateur permanent de l'État observateur de Palestine.
Thank you, Madam President. We thank Algeria for requesting this meeting in follow-up to the ICJ order in the case brought forward by South Africa against Israel on genocide. Allow me to renew our profound thanks to South Africa for its moral leadership and for this initiative that has received overwhelming support from peoples and governments across the globe. And the last one was the summit in Kampala. 120 countries of the NAM unanimously welcomed this effort by South Africa. Allow me also to thank USG Martin Griffiths for his sobering briefing on the worst man-made, occupation-made humanitarian catastrophe in modern history, and for his relentless efforts and those of the Secretary General and UN in general, notably its humanitarian personnel on the ground to bring an end to this catastrophe. Mr. President, the ICJ has offered a resounding rebuke to those who claimed that the case of genocide against Israel was meritless and baseless. The court also dismissed the premise that somehow Israel, by its very nature, would be above the law and could not be accused of committing the crime of genocide. To those with misplaced outrage by the crime, to those with misplaced outrage, be outraged by the crime, not the accusation, by reality on the ground, not the words to describe it. Enough racism and supremacy, enough impunity. Show humanity now, as the court found that the rights of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip is to be protected from acts of genocide, attempted genocide, incitement to commit genocide, complicity in genocide, and conspiracy to commit genocide are plausible. That plausibility that a genocide is actually underway, not that the accusation of genocide against Israel, is what should keep us all up at night. And I advise all of my colleagues, including some, who were so much attached to what was not on the provisional measures, concentrate on the 6 provisional measures adopted. Do not be more royalist than the king. Even the ad hoc judge of Israel voted in favor of these 2 provisional measures. Read it, study it, and reread it to know what's in it, not what the illusions in the minds of some of what was not in it. It is crystal clear that the provisional measures adopted by the court are binding, and Israel must comply with them. Mr. President, Madam President, for a while now, everybody has recognized that Israel is committing war crimes and crimes against humanity. Whether they used these words or not, through its massive indiscriminate bombing with no parallel in modern history. The forcible displacement of the population, the mass arbitrary arrest, the summary execution, including women and children raising the white flag, having a death squad storm a hospital in Jenin, disguised as civilians, as patients, as medical personnel, as a disabled person, as a mother holding a baby, to execute 3 men, including a wounded, partially paralyzed man receiving treatment. If anybody thinks that such behavior is acceptable under any circumstances, then we are throwing away the rule book and the protection it provides to all. Israel, confident its impunity will withstand, has led a war of atrocities against the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip for 4 months now. This must end. Mr. President, this Council and the Court have called for protection of civilians. Israel instead is targeting them and persisting with its mass indiscriminate attacks. This Council and the Court have called for allowing the humanitarian assistance to reach the Palestinian population through the Gaza Strip. Israel has instead maintained the siege, orchestrating famine and creating the conditions for spread of dehydration and epidemics, diseases, including among children. This Council and the Court have called to stop incitement for atrocities, crimes, and to hold accountable those responsible for such incitement. Israel instead doubled down. 12 ministers of the Netanyahu government took part in a conference to recolonize Gaza and to get rid of the Palestinians there. The continuation of a long-standing policy of displacement and replacement of the Palestinian people. Hundreds chanting and dancing, celebrating the commission of such crimes. Madam President, the Court upheld its responsibility in its provisional measures. For these provisional measures to be implemented, there has to be a ceasefire, although the burden is in Israel to implement the 6 provisional measures. But you are not assuming your responsibility in adopting a resolution to call for a ceasefire to allow the work and the provisional measures ordered by the court to be implemented. When are you going to act accordingly if you are really serious about respecting your obligations of honoring the ruling of the court? That requires a ceasefire so that Israel can implement, regardless of whether it can or not, it has to implement. But if you want to help Israel, adopt a ceasefire so that it has no excuse not to implement the 6 provisional measures by the court. Madam President, what do we do when atrocities are being committed? When they are not only an integral part of the methods of war used by the occupation power, but its primary policy. We must put an end to them. From day one, we said that this can only be accomplished by a ceasefire. And we keep repeating, ceasefire, ceasefire. The SG, he said, I need 3 things: ceasefire, ceasefire, ceasefire. Martin Griffiths repeat the same thing. Every agency of the United Nations is saying we cannot implement what needs to be implemented without a ceasefire. And yet, the Security Council, after 115 days of this abhorrent, criminal war against our people in the Gaza Strip, is continuing. 15,500 children at least have been killed while we were debating here, month after month. Over 26,000 Palestinians have been killed in terrifying circumstances. 2.3 million people have gone through hell every single day for 120 days, and this hell will haunt them long after this assault ends. They are trying to cheat death over and over again, running for safety over and over again, though it is nowhere to be found, until the international community musters the resolve to save them and to stop this war and these atrocities. 13 members of this council have voted for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, and 153 member states have supported such a ceasefire in the General Assembly. With now the risk of genocide recognized by the ICJ, it would be criminal not to act to put an end to this war of atrocities. Madam President, Netanyahu said, and I quote, "No one will stop us, not The Hague, not the axis of evil, and not anybody else," end of quotation. Spoken like a true war criminal, his genocidal words quoted by the court are evil. His genocidal acts are evil. And when the ICC finally decides to uphold its mandate, he should find his place in a jail in The Hague, not in power in Israel. All countries from across the globe have expressed support for an end of the Israeli occupation, Palestinian independence, and the two-state solution. What was the answer of Netanyahu? He bragged about sabotaging peace efforts for decades and for obstructing Palestinian independence and the two-state solution, depriving even his own people of peace and security. This is his agenda, and he has acted upon it for the last 40 years. Madam President, Israel defies the resolutions of the Council, defies the ICJ, the ICC, and it is in an open war against the UN. There is no single country on earth that has campaigned so openly and brazenly against the UN. Why is Israel attacking the UN? We wonder. Because the UN is the source of the evidence of Israel crimes, and Israel wants to discredit the witness to destroy the evidence. Because the UN helps the Palestinian people survive, remain in their land, and Israel wants to uproot them. Because the UN is the forum where Palestinian rights, foremost to self-determination and return, have been recognized, and Israel wants to deny and dissolve these rights. Because the UN has identified the requirements for just and lasting peace, and Israel has chosen ethnic cleansing and genocide instead. Israel has sought the defunding of UN agencies from UNESCO, to UNRWA. It has attacked all the main bodies of the UN, the Security Council, the General Assembly, the Human Rights Council, ECOSOC, and the ICJ. Its former foreign minister has incited against the Secretary General, and its current foreign minister has accused the Commissioner General of UNRWA of being a supporter of terrorism. An outrageous and despicable claim. Israel has launched campaigns against UN officials, including Lynn Hastings, the SG, and refused to grant visas to representatives of UN bodies as punishment for upholding their mandates. It has, in this assault, killed more than 150 UN staff, the highest number of losses by UN staff since World War II in any conflict. Israel is trying to dismantle any obstacle to its plan to destroy Palestine and the Palestinian people, to forcibly displace them and replace them, to seize full control from the river to the sea, and to implement its supremacist and colonial plans. In dealing with the Israeli allegations against some UNRWA staff, one should never lose sight of these realities and of Israel's stated goal for years now of dismantling UNRWA. And they succeeded one time during the Trump administration of denying funding for UNRWA for more than 3 years. There are serious allegations, and there is a serious investigation. The principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence must be upheld. And it is clear that UNRWA and the Secretary General are committed to these principles, and there is no reason to doubt this commitment. There is no reason to preempt the outcome of the investigation or to take measures that effectively amount to the collective punishment of 30,000 UNRWA staff and millions of refugees, beneficiaries of UNRWA services. UNRWA is the perfect example of the success of the UN. For those who are discovering UNRWA today, in the West, you created UNRWA in 1949 because you had the majority of members in the UN. It's a remarkable success story of multilateralism. We should all of us be proud that we have an organization like UNRWA in the UN system that has been doing a remarkable job in servicing in a humanitarian way the millions of the Palestinian refugees for 75 years. It is our collective duty to protect it, to fund it, to allow it to carry its humanitarian, mandate, especially in these days. Who else is in Gaza from the humanitarian institutions that can implement what you legislated in 2 resolutions in the Security Council, if you do not have the army of the brave 13,000 staff of UNRWA to implement what you want them to do, particularly in distributing and allowing massive amount of humanitarian assistance to get to every corner of the Gaza Strip. But do not fall in the trap of the Israeli government that want to destroy UNRWA. And they made that crystal clear over the years. Defend this brave organization, this fabulous example of multilateralism and the success story of the United Nations. At the time where the Palestinian people are being deliberately deprived of the requirements of life, of what they need for their survival in Gaza, undermining UNRWA would be inhumane, cruel, and irresponsible. Since you all recognize the importance of UNRWA's role and its invaluable contribution, I trust that those who decided to suspend their funding will speedily revise their decision. We appealed to you yesterday, and we supported the appeal of the Secretary General for those to reconsider, because UNRWA deserve to be funded by those who have been doing a great job in funding over so many years, and we always express our gratitude to you for your generosity in funding UNRWA. Madam President, the choice is clear, more than ever. Either allow Israel to dismantle the international law-based order or uphold its rule. It is time to end Israeli impunity, from colonialism to apartheid, from ethnic cleansing to genocide. When is it time to tell Israel enough is enough? The policy of cajoling Israel has brought to power the most openly supremacist and racist government in the history of Israel. Only accountability can help us correct course. Our roadmap is clear. Stop the genocide, ceasefire, justice, freedom, peace. In that order, that is the only pathway from this cruel madness. The Palestinian people deserve nothing less. They will accept nothing else. Justice is what they have been denied for far too long. Freedom is their birthright. Peace is our common goal and horizon. And I thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie l'observateur permanent de l'État observateur de Palestine de sa déclaration et je donne maintenant la parole au représentant d'Israël.
Thank you, Madam President. On October 7th, an actual genocidal terrorist organization that openly and proudly declares its genocidal agenda perpetrated actual genocidal acts. That same organization continues to attack Israel, to hold hostages in brutal conditions, and declares regularly its intention to repeat its atrocities again and again and again. And yet none of this has merited serious attention, let alone condemnation by this Council or anything approaching the condemnation and revulsion it should merit in United Nations reports. The message to Israel's citizens and to the hostages, not only from some addressing this Council, but too often from the Council itself, has been, your humanity does not matter to us. You're not deserving of protection. Instead, Madam President, we are witness to an obscene inversion of reality. It is not Hamas that is being charged with genocide. It is not its supporters in Tehran and Pretoria that are being held to account. It is the country that is the victim of Hamas's genocidal campaign that is again and again and again the subject of outrageous accusations, the more extreme the better, that hinge on telling a story in which Hamas, its abuse of civilians and civilian infrastructure, and its utter brutality simply disappear. That this pattern of distorting so-called reality to the Security Council is a matter of routine does not make it morally acceptable. And it only compounds the disconnect between what is so often said in this chamber and what is happening in actual reality. A lie told 1,000 times is not less of a lie. Yes, the civilian suffering in this war, to both Israelis and Palestinians, is tragic. It is heart-wrenching. But it is impossible to understand this tragedy, much less respond to it, by spinning reality. As Israel stated before the ICJ, Israel is committed, as it must be, to comply with the law, and it does so in the face of Hamas's utter contempt for the law. Israel is committed, as it must be, to demonstrate humanity, but it does so in the face of Hamas's utter inhumanity. These commitments are unwavering, and exist quite independently of any IJC proceedings. But if Hamas's contempt for the law is never part of the discussion, if its utter inhumanity towards Palestinian civilians as well as Israelis civilians is simply ignored, then we are not dealing with the agonizing reality and the dilemmas that Israel faces, seeking to minimize civilian harm against a lawless terrorist organization that seeks to maximize it. We are dealing with a libel. There is a reason the Palestinian representative today and the supporters of Hamas, such as South Africa and Algeria, must present so distorted a reality to the Council. It is obvious. For them, the brutal reality created by Hamas does not exist, and indeed cannot exist. For if it did, there would be no possible case of genocide. And the effort to demonize Israel, to tell a story where one side is the victim and the other side is a villain, would collapse. Rather, Israel will be a democratic country exercising its right and duty to defend its citizens under near impossible conditions and from a truly genocidal threat. Madam President, it is hardly surprising that those who have no qualms about distorting the facts have no hesitation about distorting the law. The very attempt to level the charge of genocide against Israel is an outrageous distortion of the Genocide Convention. It is an attempt to empty the word of its unique force and special meaning, and to turn the convention itself into a tool of terrorists who have total disdain for life and for the law against those trying to defend against them. The same distortion of the law is now being applied in a transparent attempt to twist and misinterpret the decision of the Court on preliminary measures. The Court's decision on provisional measures was issued less than a week ago. The matter is before the Court. The arguments on the merits of the case have not even been heard, let alone decided. Yet already the Council has convened, already the allegations have been levelled, already the abusive and politicised nature of this process has been laid bare. The desperate attempt to ascribe blame is transparent political theatre, a verdict looking for a crime. So it seems appropriate to set the record straight. First, the assertion made with such confidence by the Palestinian representative that the Court has found plausible evidence of genocide is a prime example of this desperate distortion. This is a blatant mischaracterization of the very nature of the provisional measures phase of proceedings, of the term plausibility in the Court's jurisprudence, and of the Court's actual decision. The Court could not have been clearer that it has not and could not make at this preliminary stage any finding on the charge of genocide levelled by South Africa. Israel is confident that South Africa's libel against Israel will be rejected by the ICJ at the merits phase of proceedings. Already it has been widely denounced by numerous states known for their commitment to the rule of law, but the Court at this early phase of proceedings had no authority to make findings on the merits and did not do so. As the Court stated in paragraph 30, and I quote, "At the present stage of the proceedings, the Court is not required to ascertain whether any violations of Israel's obligations under the Genocide Convention have occurred. Such a finding could be made by the Court only at the stage of the examination of the merits of the present case." End of quote. Later, presumably realizing that some may have difficulty understanding this paragraph, the Court reiterated this assertion in paragraph 62 and then again in paragraph 84. It stated, "The decision given in the present proceedings is in no way prejudges the question of the jurisdiction of the Court to deal with the merits of the case or any questions relating to the admissibility of the application or to the merits themselves." End of quote. If the point wasn't clear enough in the decision, Judges Bandari and Malta in their declarations also left no room for misunderstanding. So much for the claim that South Africa's outrageous and false accusations have been given legitimacy by the Court. Second, the supporters of Hamas genocidal terrorism are similarly and ludicrously trying to assert that the Court has called on Israel to cease its military operations. The opposite is the case. In fact, the Court unanimously and rightly rejected South Africa's vile attempt to undermine Israel's inherent right to defend itself against the genocidal terrorists of Hamas. Not a single judge suggested otherwise, nor could they have. The very idea that Israel would be denied this fundamental right while Hamas would be free to continue its terrorist onslaught and hold hostages in brutal captivity is morally and legally unthinkable. Indeed, by emphasizing that both parties to the conflict are bound by international humanitarian law, the Court clearly indicated that it understands that military operations will continue. The egregious provisional measures requested by South Africa were effectively and summarily dismissed by the Court. The measures indicated relate in practice to existing legal obligations to which Israel is already committed. As demonstrated in word and deed, Israel's war is against Hamas, not against Palestinian civilians. This is a matter of explicit government policy, military directives, and procedures. It is no less an expression of Israel's core values. As stated, our commitment to uphold the law, including our obligations under international humanitarian law, is unwavering and exists independent of any IJC proceedings and of Hamas's contempt for the law. In this context, Israel remains committed to mitigating civilian harm and to facilitating access to humanitarian aid according to the law, despite all the challenges, while also seeking to assure, as this Council noted in Resolution 2720, both its humanitarian nature and that it reaches its civilian destination and is not stolen by Hamas. Israel is continuing to work with international stakeholders to further advance this objective. Israel is also committed to preventing incitement. Like every law-abiding democracy, Israel makes rigorous efforts to draw the line between permissible statements, even those that express pain and outrage in times of crisis, and those which go beyond the limits of free speech. As Israel's Attorney General stated publicly recently, any statement calling for intentional harm to civilians contradicts the policy of the State of Israel and may amount to a criminal offense, including the offense of incitement. Several such cases are currently being examined by Israeli law enforcement authorities. And Israel also respects the role given to the ICJ for the settlement of disputes. What it does not respect is the blatant abuse of the court and its procedures by South Africa, and the unconscionable efforts to distort the truth in support of a genocidal terrorist organization at the expense of both Israelis and Palestinians, who both deserve a peaceful and prosperous future free of the death cult of Hamas. Finally, Madam President, it is quite telling that in the warped description of the court's decision by Hamas's defenders, no mention is made of the court's grave concern for the hostages and its unequivocal call for their immediate and unconditional release. Nor, of course, is mention made of the call of one of the judges for South Africa to use its warm relations with the terrorist organization to help secure the hostages' release. It is telling, but not surprising. Nothing about the description we have heard of the court's decision, nothing about this grotesque use of the ICJ, nothing about the breathless convening of this meeting of the Security Council has to do with the law. It is about distorting the facts and the law so that they can be used as a weapon, and it's an assault on the integrity of the ICJ as an institution as much as it is an assault on the truth. It should be treated by this Council accordingly. Many today have raised the issue of UNRWA and the active and direct role that employees of this UN agency played in the October 7th massacre. Israel welcomes the decision of many countries to suspend their funding to UNRWA and calls for an in-depth, independent and transparent investigation into the agency's conduct in the Gaza Strip, both regarding the involvement of UNRWA employees in the October 7th massacre and regarding the employment of Hamas operatives and the involvement of terrorist elements in its activities. Madam President, incredibly, the Security Council has convened again and again to discuss the situation, to discuss the spin and distortions of Hamas's supporters, and yet it still has been unable to condemn the massacres of October 7th by the genocidal terrorists of Hamas, their genocidal incitement, or their reprehensible terrorist strategy that causes untold suffering to both Israeli and Palestinian civilians. Until it does, this Council will fail to meet its responsibilities. It will continue to be abused as a forum where lies can be told, where the law can be manipulated to serve its greatest violators, where the victims of terrorism will feel abandoned, and where, in the words of Judge Barak at the ICJ, the crimes of Cain can be attributed to Abel. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant d'Israël de sa déclaration et je donne maintenant la parole à la représentante d'Afrique du Sud.
Madam President, I thank you, Algeria, and members of the Security Council for providing South Africa an opportunity to address the Council at this briefing today. We thank the UN Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, Martin Griffiths, for his briefing. This briefing and the statements of many members of the Council that we have heard this morning provides a glaring reflection of the devastating situation in Gaza and the atrocities being committed in Palestine through the targeting of civilians, civilian infrastructure, UN premises, and other vulnerable targets. The actions that we are all witnessing daily by Israel are a violation of international law, including the UN Charter, the Geneva Convention and its protocols. As South Africa has stated before, by its attacks on and kidnapping of innocent civilians, Hamas has also violated international law. Madam President, the events of the past few months in Gaza have illustrated that Israel is acting contrary to its international law obligations, including those in terms of the Genocide Convention. South Africa has thus opted to resort to international judicial mechanisms, including at the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, to seek justice for the people of Palestine. We reiterate that the international community cannot proclaim the importance of international law and the importance of the UN Charter in some situations and not in others, as if the rule of law only applies to a select few. For international law to be credible, it should be uniformly applied and not selective. Accordingly, on 29 December 2023, South Africa filed an application instituting legal proceedings at the International Court of Justice against Israel under the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, with respect to the Israeli conduct in the present conflict in Gaza. The matter was heard in The Hague on 11 and 12 January 2024 in relation to the request for provisional measures. South Africa and Israel are both parties to the Genocide Convention, which has as its objective the prevention and punishment of perpetrators of the crime of genocide, which includes, in accordance with Article 3 of the Convention, genocide, conspiracy to commit genocide, direct and public incitement to commit genocide, attempt to commit genocide, and complicity in genocide. On 26 January 2024, the court delivered its order on South Africa's request for provisional measures, determining that Israel's action in Gaza are possibly genocidal. The court was near unanimous in its order for provisional measures, which include that Israel shall take all measures within its power to prevent all acts of genocide as contained in Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, and prevent and punish direct and public incitement to do so. Israel is furthermore required to take effective measures to provide urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance. Madam President, it is not just about more aid. It is about complete, unhindered aid. Further, Israel must ensure effective measures are taken to prevent the destruction of evidence and ensure its preservation. Importantly, Israel is required to provide a report to the court on the measures it has taken to give effect to these provisional measures within 1 month. These provisional measures are directly binding on Israel, which is required pursuant to the court's order and to the Genocide Convention itself to stop all acts by it that are plausibly genocidal. There's clearly no credible basis for Israel to continue to claim that its military actions are in full compliance with international law, including the Genocide Convention, having regard to the court's ruling. Additionally, following the court's order, third states are now on notice of the existence of a serious risk of genocide against the Palestinian people in Gaza. They must therefore also act independently and immediately to prevent genocide by Israel and to ensure that they are not themselves in violation of the Genocide Convention, including by aiding or assisting in the commission of genocide. This necessarily imposes an obligation on all states to cease funding and facilitating Israel's military actions, which are plausibly genocidal. The ICJ ruling, as read out by Judge Donahue of the United States, noted that Israel used the notion of self-defense as it attempted defense of the actions of which South Africa maintained were genocidal. The court only noted that the Israeli defense without giving it any further credence. It did not have to, as the court and the judges are well aware of its own advisory opinion in 2004 in the matter pertaining to the legal consequences of the construction of a wall in the occupied Palestinian territory, where the court asserted that an occupying power cannot rely on Article 51 with regards to the people that it occupies. Therefore, the assertion by the representatives of the United States and Israel that the court reaffirmed the U.S. understanding of the issue of self-defense is not accurate. Madam President, the decision by the court marks a decisive victory for the international rule of law and a significant milestone in the search for justice for the Palestinian people. The court's decision also affirms the importance of global governance institutions, including organs of the United Nations. It remains vital for all member states to respect and implement the decisions of the court. Hopefully, it will provide a new impetus to the search for a lasting political solution, peace and stability in the Middle East. South Africa sincerely hopes that Israel will not act to frustrate the application of this order, as it has publicly threatened to do so, but that it will instead act to comply with it fully, as it is bound to do so. Unfortunately, in the days since the court's decision, we have seen the Israeli government continue its illegal actions in violation of the court order. South Africa will continue to act within institutions of global governance to protect the rights, including the fundamental right to life, of Palestinians in Gaza, which continue to remain at urgent risk, including from Israeli military assault, starvation, and disease, and to obtain the fair and equal application of international law to all in the interest of our collective humanity. Notably, South Africa will continue to do everything within its power to preserve the existence of the Palestinian people as a group, to end all acts of apartheid and genocide against the Palestinian people, and to work with them to the realization of their collective right to self-determination. South Africa welcomes the support expressed by several countries, and we encourage states that are so inclined to approach the court to intervene in the proceedings so as to send a strong message to the international community that the situation in Gaza Strip is indefensible. Madam President, South Africa has noted with great concern the allegations by Israel that 12 UNRWA staff members were involved in October 7 attacks. We welcome the announcement by the Secretary General that the United Nations is taking swift action following the allegations, and that an investigation by the UN's Office of International Oversight was immediately activated. We are extremely concerned by the announcement by various countries of their intention to withdraw humanitarian funding to UNRWA following the accusations. South Africa supports the call by the UN Secretary General for the countries that have decided to withdraw or pause their funding for UNRWA to reconsider their decision. UNRWA has been providing life-saving humanitarian assistance to Palestinians for decades. Withdrawing funding from UNRWA will worsen an already dire and complex humanitarian situation. South Africa appeals to those countries to reconsider their decisions. In conclusion, Madam President, South Africa would like to repeat what it stated a few days ago in this chamber. War is never wise. When the use of force is utilized anywhere in the world, irrespective of whether it is lawful or unlawful, the laws of war must be applied, and civilians must be protected. This Council must fulfill its mandate and focus its efforts on enforcing peace. I thank you.
Je remercie la représentante d'Afrique du Sud de sa déclaration. Il n'y a plus d'oratrices et d'orateurs inscrits sur la liste. J'invite à présent les membres du Conseil à poursuivre l'examen de la question dans le cadre de consultation. Mais avant de lever la séance, qui est la dernière prévue pour le mois de janvier, je souhaitais adresser les plus sincères remerciements de la délégation française aux membres de ce Conseil, ainsi qu'au secrétariat du Conseil pour l'appui qu'ils nous ont fourni. Au terme d'un mois chargé, nous pouvons nous féliciter d'avoir pu dégager un consensus autour de plusieurs questions importantes dont nous étions saisis, et nous n'aurions pu y parvenir seuls. L'ardeur à la tâche, l'appel et le concours de chacune des délégations, des représentants du secrétariat, y compris des membres de l'équipe d'appui technique, du personnel chargé du service des séances, des interprètes, des traducteurs, des rédacteurs de procès-verbaux et de tout le personnel de sécurité y sont pour beaucoup. Et alors que notre présidence se termine, je sais que tous les membres du Conseil s'associent à moi pour souhaiter très bonne chance à la délégation du Guyana, et qui prend la présidence pour le mois de février. Et je vous remercie, la séance est levée.